So, welcome to my channel. Again, this is Dr. Emmanuel. I just want us to do a very quick revision on the gross anatomy of the brainstem, the human brainstem. So, the brainstem is a part of the brain that comprises your midbrain, the pons, so the midbrain there, the pons, and the medulla. So the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla comprise or constitute your midbrain. So just looking at this Frank Netter's atlas, this is the posterior lateral view of the midbrain. We can see the posterior part of the midbrain. We have the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. And then on the lateral side, we have the cerebral crus. So plural is crura. So on each side, lateral side, you have the crus, the cerebral crus of the midbrain. And you have the right and left superior colliculi, right and left inferior colliculi. You've got your medial geniculate body, your lateral geniculate body. That's the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is actually part of the diencephalon. Some people include the diencephalon as part of the midbrain. Some other, authorities keep the diencephalon, classify the diencephalon as part of the forebrain. So still on this posterior lateral part, we can see the trochlear nerve emerging from the posterior part of the midbrain. At the midbrain pontine junction, you can see the trochlear nerve emerging posteriorly and then running via the lateral side. Okay, it runs laterally to the anterior part, to the trochlear nerve. And just to mention, this trochlear nerve among all the cranial nerves, is the cranial nerve with the longest intracranial course. So it's not the longest cranial nerve, because the vagus nerve is, but the trochlear nerve is a cranial nerve with the longest intracranial course. So this is the pons. We can see the cerebellar peduncles, the superior cerebellar peduncle, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and then the middle cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so the peduncles of the cerebellum are the areas, the parts of the cerebellum through which it connects with the midbrain. Those are the peduncles. And then posteriorly on the medulla, we can see the gray-side tubercle at the middle, and we can see the cuneate tubercle. So these tubercles actually contain all these projections. They contain nuclei, these colliculi, geniculate bodies. They contain nuclei, and that's why they are, they are bulging. They've got nuclei beneath them, or underneath them. You can see the vestibulocochlear nerve, the facial nerve. So this is the olive. This is called an olive. This oval structure is called an olive. And then anterior to the olive, you can see the hypoglossal nerve emerging. And then posteriorly, you have the vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve. You can see the accessory nerve, which is the 11th cranial nerve. You see the roots of the accessory nerve. So let's proceed to the next slide. So the brainstem is the posterior stalk-like part of the brain. It looks like a stalk if you look at it. It looks like a stalk, isn't it? That connects the cerebrum, which is the forebrain, with the spinal cord. In the human brain, the brainstem is composed of the midbrain, the pons, veruli, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is continuous with the thalamus of the diencephalon through the tentorial notch, and sometimes the diencephalon is included in the brain. So sometimes the diencephalon is included in the midbrain. This page is an extract from Wikipedia. I usually like Wikipedia. It helps me understand things. So the function of the brainstem is very small. making up only about 2.6% of the total weight of the brain. It has the critical function of regulating cardiac and respiratory function, helping to control your heart rate, your breathing rate. The brainstem also provides main motor and sensory nerve supply to the face and neck via the cranial nerve. So we'll find out that all the cranial nerves actually originate from the brainstem. 10 pairs of cranial nerves come from the brainstem. Other roles include the regulation of the central nervous system and the body's sleep cycle. The brainstem is also of prime importance in conveyance of motor and sensory pathways from the rest of the brain. So if you look at this brainstem, you will see, if you look anteriorly, by the time we look at the anterior part of the brainstem, we'll see the pyramids and the olive. So this olive, I'll have the pyramids. So these pyramids, via these pyramids, you have your corticospinal tracts, that convey motor information from the forebrain to the spinal cord. These pathways include the corticospinal tracts, the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, which is the sensory pathway, and the spinal thalamic pathway, which is the ascending. Spinal thalamic is the ascending sensory pathway. So this is an anterior view of the brainstem. Okay, we have this. You have part of the cerebral cortex there, and the diencephalon. And then we now have our midbrain. So this is the cerebral cross, the right and left cerebral crura of the midbrain. We have our trochlear nerve there coming from behind, as we saw previously. It emerges from behind, and you can see it curling laterally to emerge anteriorly. Remember, the trochlear nerve has the longest intracranial course, but it's not the longest cranial nerve. The vagus nerve, when you put the intracranial and extracranial courses together, has the longest length amongst all the cranial nerves. So emerging from the anterior part between the pons, at the level of the junction between the midbrain and the pons, you have your oculomotor nerve. This is our pons. This is the pons. Looks like the head of a mushroom from this anterior view. Emerging from the pons, you have our trigeminal nerve, the roots of the trigeminal nerve. Emerging from the pontomedullary junction, we have the cranial nerve 6, which is the abducens nerve, and we have our facial and intermediate nerve. So the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7, and the intermediate nerve of Reisberg. So the intermediate nerve is a nerve that accompanies the facial and vestibulocochlear nerve. It has a similar course. So the vestibulocochlear nerve, so 6, 7, and 8 emerge from the pontomedullary junction. If you look at it, the junction between the pons and the medulla. That's it. Okay. The trigeminal nerve emerges from the substance of the pons. Okay. The oculomotor and trochlear nerve emerge from the midbrain pontine junction. So still looking at the anterior aspects of the medulla, we've already mentioned the pyramids, which are longitudinal structures in the midline. We have the olive to the lateral side of each pyramid. They also convey, tracts, descending tracts. So here you can see what is called the decussation of pyramids. So decussation are those areas where the corticospinal tracts decussate or cross over. So there's some crossing over that happens in these areas. We have the accessory nerve, which is the 11th cranial nerve. So we have the olive, and to the front of the olive we have the hypoglossal nerve emerging, the roots of the hypoglossal nerve, and behind we have the 9th and 10th cranial nerves, the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves emerging. Let's proceed. Posterior view, similar to the posterolateral view which we saw initially. We have the midbrain there, superior and inferior colliculi, right and left. We have the crura, the cerebral crura. We have the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles, which are the structures. You see this is the cerebellum, and the cerebellar peduncles carry nerve fibers, that connect the midbrain to the cerebellum. And then this is the rhomboid fossa, which is the floor of the fourth ventricle. Okay, and in this rhomboid fossa, we can see the posterior median sulcus. This is the pons. Okay, this is the pons, the posterior surface of the pons. We can see the posterior median sulcus, and we have the facial. This is the medial eminence. We have the medial eminence. And the facial colliculus. Okay, facial colliculus. The vestibular area, we have the vagal trigone, and we have the trigeminal tubercle. So if you look at all these things, these are projections, elevations. Beneath these elevations, you have nuclei of cranial nerves. Like you see, this is facial colliculus. Beneath it, you have the origin, the nucleus of the facial nerve. This trigeminal tubercle. Okay, trigeminal tubercle is right there. You have beneath it, you have the extensive, origin of the trigeminal nerve. And you have the vagal trigone. Beneath it, you have the origin, the nuclei of the vagus nerve. Hypoglossal trigone. Beneath it, you have, the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. So that's all these elevations are, they contain neural tissues. Behind it again, we have the gracile tubercle, which is it's a tubercle because it's a ball, which you can see it. And then beneath it, you have the gracile fasciculus. And then you have the cuneate tubercle and the cuneate fasciculus. Okay, these are posterior. So what it means is that what's the nerve fibers that track posteriorly from the spinal cord upwards are usually the spinothalamic, the sensory ascending pathway tracts. So looking at the nuclei of the cranial nerves, and their spatial orientation with their spatial orientation, spatial location within the brainstem. Here you have the oculomotor, the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve, and the accessory oculomotor nucleus, which is called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So they are in the midbrain. So the oculomotor nuclei are in the midbrain. Same as the trochlear, that's the trochlear nucleus, the fourth cranial nerve, also in the midbrain. But you can see it's very close to the midbrain pontine junction. And then in the pons, you have the trigeminal nerve, the trigeminal nucleus. Okay, that's the motto, the trigeminal nerve, nucleus. That's efferent. Okay, that's the motto. The motor component of trigeminal nerve. The nucleus is in the pons. The sensory aspects, which is afferent fibers, you can see the blues labeled afferents, which are sensory. So the sensory or afferent nuclei of the trigeminal nerve is actually extensive. So that's the main one, which is in the pons. And then you have the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is this upward projection. And below you have the spinal tract and spinal nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, which are actually sensory. So the sensory nucleus is actually long. You can see it's extensive. It has the mesencephalic, it has the main trigeminal sensory nucleus, and it has the spinal tract, and spinal nucleus. So that's the cranial nerve 5. Cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 6 abducens, you see, is actually still in the pons at the level of the pontomedullary junction, close to that. That's the abducens nucleus. Okay, and then the facial nucleus also at the pontomedullary area. That's the facial, the motor part of the facial nerve. And the sensory part of the facial nerve is from the superior salivatory nucleus. So this superior salivatory nucleus provides the sensory aspect of the facial nerve, which supplies the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. Okay, the anterior two-thirds of your tongue is supplied by the facial nerve. Whereas the motor aspect controls your facial muscles of facial expression. Okay, and coming to your glossopharyngeal nerve, same thing. Glossopharyngeal nerve has a motor and a sensory aspect. So the sensory aspect of your glossopharyngeal nerve comes from the inferior salivatory nuclei. Okay, the inferior salivatory nuclei. The glossopharyngeal nerve supplies, innervation to the posterior one-third of your tongue, and also and then gives motor innervation to your pharyngeal muscles, which help you to swallow and all of that. Okay, pharyngeal muscles. So it's glossopharyngeal. Glosso means tongue, pharyngeal means pharynx. Okay. So this is your vagus nerve. If you look here, you see that this glossopharyngeal gets from the inferior salivatory, and also gets some motor fibers from this, from this nucleus ambiguous. The ambiguous nucleus ambiguous, you can see, gives origin to the vagus nerve. Okay, it gives origin to the vagus nerve. You can see. Okay, and it also gives some contribution to the accessory nerve, the nucleus ambiguous. This is a dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. The dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. Okay, so you see the vagal nuclei, are in the medulla. The nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve is in the medulla. So this is 10 and this is 11 accessory nuclei, also in the medulla and the spinal cord, because you have the spinal roots of the accessory nerve and the medullary roots of the accessory nerve. So this just gives you an understanding. So if someone has a pontine, a midbrain stroke, it can affect the oculomotor nerve. If someone has a pontine stroke, it can affect your trigeminal, it can affect your abducens. If someone has a medullary stroke, then you can have it can affect your vagus nerve, your swallowing, difficulty protecting your airway, difficulty in swallowing, and things like that can be affected. This is a lateral view of the same thing we've just mentioned. We've got the cranial nerve 3, we've got the cranial nerve 4, trochlear nerve there. Okay, we've got the extensive sensory or afferent nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. We've got the mesencephalic. We've got the main trigeminal nucleus, which is called the principal sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve, and we've got the spinal tract and spinal nucleus. The motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is just right there next to the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. We've got our abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve 6, and then we've got our facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7. So you see that it keeps descending. We've got 6, we've got 7, in descending order. You've got your cranial nerve 8, if you trace it there. So 8 is vestibular and cochlear. You can see we've got the anterior and posterior cochlear nuclei. We've got the cochlear nuclei, and we've got the vestibular nuclei. Where is that? Yeah, the vestibular nuclei. Okay, it's there. So we've got 8, we've got 9, the glossopharyngeal. If you trace that, glossopharyngeal coming from both the inferior salivatory nucleus and the nucleus ambiguous. We've got our vagus nerve coming from nucleus ambiguous and the dorsal vagus nucleus. We've got the accessory nerve, and we've got the hypoglossal nucleus of hypoglossal nerve and hypoglossal nucleus. So you can see how these cranial nerves emerge from the brainstem. So the brainstem plays a very vital role. We know that the vagus nerve plays a very important role in cardiac regulation. Okay, the vagus nerve in your cardiovascular regulation, in your respiratory control of your respiration. So you see that these brainstem is a vital aspect for survival. So if you have a brainstem stroke, it's a very big problem for you. So we've come to the end of this very brief revision. I hope it's been very helpful. If you think it's been very helpful, Please like the video and subscribe for future videos which will come. Thank you very much.